Hello everyone, welcome once again to Geeks Not Nerds, the podcast. I'm Captain Logan.
And I am Vince.
Welcome to week 4 of our workshop on writing. Vince, today we're going to talk about dialogue.
Yeah, let's talk about talking.
Indeed. Let's jump straight into it, shall we? Vince, the first thing I wanted to mention is that, this is the big thing about dialogue, really, is that characters should only speak when it furthers the narrative. There's going to be a lot of time that you're going to want to have a character say something just because it feels natural to you at the time. This is when a character would say something, but you need to look at it. You need to really look at it and see: is this necessary for character development? Is it necessary for the story that you're trying to tell?
A lot of the time, people get caught in this sort of Tarantinian way of just chit chat, just things happening, like oh. Well, you know about Becky, right? Well, does Becky ever show up in there? No. So why are we talking about Becky? What's important about Becky? There is only so much that you can do, and let's make it relevant to the entire piece.
Mm-hmm. Also, understand what we mean by furthering the narrative, because furthering the narrative does not mean exposition and dialogue. People will hear that term, furthering the narrative, and they'll think, oh, so that means that I can write as much dialogue as I want to, as long as it's giving information. No, dialogue is not often about giving information. Sometimes it is, but if you're writing, if you're writing a story, the exposition should come in the exposition. That's why we call it that. And if you're writing a film script or a comic book script or something like that, in a comic book you can have narration boxes, so there is some place for some exposition. But you also have that visual element, so you don't need too much of that. So you never want to have in anything that you're writing, you never want to have characters walk into a room and tell you things that you can either easily infer yourself or that can be given in another way. So you want to find clever ways to make that exposition happen. If you're writing a movie, but if you're writing prose, then that's going to come from the exposition.
I mean, last time when we talked about, I believe it was plot. That's what we talked about last time. We said show don't tell, and if your characters are giving exposition in their dialogue, that's still telling.
Yeah,
you're just having a character do it.
Mm-hmm. And it always comes off as unnatural. Just like we were talking about with exposition, you want to also make your dialogue as natural as possible, and we'll get into some of that. But natural dialogue is not a character telling another character what he already knows. Mm-hmm. And so very often that's what exposition and dialogue ends up being. Because what is exposition for, Vince? It's for the reader. It's for the viewer. It's for us who are watching or reading, so that we know what we're looking at. So if Frank is talking to Bob and Frank tells Bob about the new living room suit Bob just bought, and he already knows that.
Yeah. Like, I realize how many buttons are on here, or at least I didn't care.
I made the purchase. Yeah, exactly.
But
or whatever. How often, like a sitcom or something? Sorry, have you seen like a character say something like that TV you just bought last week? Yes, I do. I bought it. You know what I mean? Like it's a really stupid thing to have a character say.
Yeah, and even if people say it in real life, it wastes time for the reader. And it's uninteresting.
Mm-hmm.
But I was watching a show called Greg the Bunny the other day, and in this show they have some big civil rights leader call Greg the Bunny. And he says, oh, it's so-and-so, whatever the civil rights leader's name is. The civil rights leader. And one of the characters says, oh, nobody knew who that was. Thanks for clearing that up. So they're making fun of this common thing that they do. And so, a guy says, hey, you know that TV you bought? Yeah, glad you cleared that one up. I would have known which TV it was.
Do be sure, if you don't know already, do be sure that you learn how to format dialogue correctly. And this is not to insult anyone's intelligence, but I read stories all the time where people just somehow were not taught how to format dialogue. And also, this goes for exposition and everything else also. Learn correct grammar and punctuation if you don't already know. But with dialogue, there are just a lot of mistakes that people make, and people make careless mistakes even when they know how to do it right. A lot of times people will just kind of brush over it and not pay attention, and it makes your piece look really unprofessional, really unreadable. And remember what I said last week and the week before, no one wants to read your story, so why would you try to make it harder for them to read it, right?
I don't know how many people have said, just get 10 pages in, or get 10 chapters in, or get get 3 episodes in or 25 episodes in. I'm like, why? Why would I want to put myself through the torture to read your crap? I mean, why don't you write something, that's not effort? I mean, why should I? If you're writing fiction, the idea is that it's supposed to be enjoyable. So write something that you would find enjoyable, and perhaps your reader will find enjoyable. I mean, don't.
But also make it readable.
Yeah, don't make it tedious to get through.
And you've got to follow modern conventions of writing, and of course, and I'm talking when I say modern conventions at the moment, I'm talking about with punctuation and grammar. And I don't want to get into this, of course, but the text beat thing has killed us. And not knowing how to spell and things like that has really been bad for a lot of people in the last 10 or 15 years coming up into school and learning how to write.
Spell check doesn't catch everything.
No,
so.
And the thing is, we write all the time in our culture. We constantly write in shorthand. We constantly write without punctuation. Well, I don't, but a lot of people do when they're texting and when they're IMing and things like that. You really have to put that aside if that's how you write letters and things to people, and you have to realize that there is a professional way to do this, and if you ever want anyone to read it, regardless of publication, you've got to do it the right way. So if you don't know, learn it. And we're not going to get into all the punctuation and grammar stuff here, but if you don't know how to correctly format dialogue, if you don't know where the what goes inside the parentheses when, and where the commas go, seriously, man, there's a lot of people who have not figured this out.
Well, there are grammar books, and there are you can, if you're still in high school, you can ask your teacher. If you're still in college, you can ask your teacher.
But learn it.
Yeah.
It's extremely important. So learn it. Vince, let's talk about dialogue tags and how not to use them. when you're and by the way, you're gonna read books all the time that use these. They're just not necessary, okay? Just because you see something that's like, by the way, I just want to say this really fast. Just because you see something that's published doesn't mean that everything that it does is the correct thing to do, okay?
Good point.
A lot of published things do things wrong all the time, and maybe wrong is not the right word. Maybe that's too harsh, but you can make your work. You can make your work better and more compelling by doing certain things. And so, what I mean by dialogue tags is anything that is not said or asked. Okay, don't write like when you finish a line of dialogue. Don't write he postured or he snarled or he harumphed. Okay? Don't do that. From the context of the situation and how your character talks, we should be able to gather the posturing or the snarling or the harumphing, okay? You're gonna be giving your readers a lot more credit if you don't keep restating things. And it's a lot like what we were talking about last week with exposition. Don't keep restating stuff.
That's also an example of show, don't tell. I mean, because if you're telling us what your character's doing, then, maybe the emotion that you're trying to convey through his dialogue doesn't mesh well with what you're telling us that he's doing.
Mm-hmm.
Like, Becky, please hand me that salt. She yelled. You know what I mean? I mean, we don't use a certain kind of, like, for example, here we go. I know I'm getting to be a little cluster hoo-ha here, but when I was in school, one of the things they had us do is say, write as if you're writing from a character's voice. So write a character who's regional. Make something that they're saying regionally defined. And don't get into that phonetic spelling of words. That makes sense?
Yeah, that's a later point I've got. But
yeah. Okay then.
Well, we're going to get into that.
I'll back up.
This isn't about the phonetic thing. I just wanted to talk about dialogue tags because, and again, it's about not restating things. The other thing too is that dialogue tags make your fiction sound like juvenile fiction, makes it sound like kids fiction, because you're going to read kids books all the time that say things like he yelled or he harumphed, things like that. You don't have to do that. Use your context of a situation and how. But you're right in that the way a person talks tells you a lot, and you can use actions to your advantage because, and we'll get into this, but you of course want your characters to very often be doing things while they're talking, and so the actions they do also will convey emotion, right? So we can already infer that a character is irritated without telling in a dialogue tag that the character is irritated. And so at the same time, you also don't want to use adverbs. You don't want to say, he said irritatingly. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
That kind of thing. You don't need that. You don't need that. Just use said, okay? And I know it sounds boring, but it's a lot better. It's gonna come off as a lot smarter, a lot more professional if you just say said. If a character asks a question, asked is okay. Said is okay, asked is okay, and then like a replied or something like that every so often is okay. Now, how do you keep your dialogue from sounding really redundant if your characters are constantly, if at the end of everything you constantly say he said, she said, he said, she said? How do you keep that? Because that gets irritating. How do you get rid of that? Well, if you got two people talking in a room, we don't need any tags after the first two, because once one person says something and then the next person says something and we're said, Becky said this, Joe said this, right? Mm-hmm. Then as we're dropping our paragraph breaks down, because every time a new person talks, of course, we drop to a new paragraph, we can infer who's speaking when, because it's a back and forth conversation. If you've got more than two people talking, which you shouldn't do too often. More often than not, your conversation should be just two people talking when you can help it. But when you have to have, or two people primarily and then other people jumping in. But if you have If you do have like a group kind of conversation, which of course will come up, then you're going to have to do that more often. But still, don't use tags at all when you don't need them.
I mean, the idea is that under the context, we know which character is taking which point of view, so we don't need you to say that he said that they support the rights of snakes to bear arms. So, because of course she doesn't support that, so we know she's not saying that.
Right, and I support that because I don't think it's really an issue. I think it's a non-issue. Snakes holding arms. Snakes don't even have arms, so how can they hold arms? So as you said, phonetic spellings, don't do it. Don't write an accent. Use the vocabulary of an accent, but don't use the spelling. All right, don't change the spelling. Yeah. It's about how a character talks, but again, don't make it hard to read. If we've got to decipher another language, you're making us work too hard.
Yeah, and that's one of the things that they do it in some classic literature. Mark Twain does it a lot, or did it a lot.
It used to be the modern convention. It's not anymore.
It's
not generally accepted now.
Like, one of the things that bothers me, I'll read comic books, and one of the things they always do with Cajun characters is make them say instead of I'm, and sugar instead of sugar. I'm like,
if we're
you can
told
make us just say
a character has an accent, we can infer that.
Yeah.
And if they're talking with the vernacular that they would use, we can infer the accent. We don't need you to pretend like you know how to make words look like a British accent. You tell me, and that's a tell thing. That's a tell thing. Tell me a character has a British accent, and then write with a British vernacular. And also, don't be too stereotypical about that, though. Like, don't feel like the character has to say bloody every other word just to remind us they're British. Just say what they would say. And if you don't know, do some research. This is a big one, Vince. Realistic dialogue is not necessarily real-life dialogue. Yeah. Tell me if you agree with this.
Oh, I totally agree with that. I mean, there's a movie that I like, and I like to say that it's not as bad as people say it is. But it's Diary of the Dead. And one of the things that they say in Diary of the Dead is like characters will see something that can't possibly be happening because, of course, zombies don't exist in real life, and this is the onset of the zombie apocalypse. And people say, no, this can't be happening. Well, of course, somebody would say that, but it's not interesting to put on screen.
Your dialogue needs to sound natural for the story, but again, we have to be able to follow what's being said. So the way your buddies talk is not necessarily going to be interesting for your story. And it's not necessarily going to be credible for your story. So take what take what works. Really do listen to the way people talk, but take what works and then leave out what doesn't. And it really is a lot of trial and error, Vince. Like there's we could really get into it, but I mean it's the kind of thing that you just have to learn as you go along how to make dialogue sound real. And you're going to find that even the most natural sounding dialogue is made up, is contrived. People do not talk in real life like they talk in fiction. But if you make people in fiction talk just like everybody you know in real life, it's not going to sound realistic. It's very interesting how that works, and it just is the way it is.
I think part of the deal is that you make a character sound real without all the extra haves and justs and uhs and ums. Like, you wouldn't say like every other word. You wouldn't say every other sentence.
Yeah.
You wouldn't do this type of thing. And if you are...
You wouldn't stutter constantly. This is funny. I've never seen anybody do this in a story, but this is just an example of something in real life that you wouldn't put in a story. Okay, how often in your everyday life, Vince, does someone ask you to repeat something you said because they couldn't hear you?
Quite often.
How often does it happen in stories? Never.
Good stories? Never.
Hardly ever. I mean, unless it's important. You know what I mean? It'll happen every so often. I don't mean that, but I'm just saying that, like, for the most part, you're rarely, if ever, going to see that happen unless the character's like deaf or can't hear very well, or if it's like, oh, there's like a loud noise, and so you have to repeat yourself. But I mean, just the everyday. You're across the room, I'm over here, and you're not talking loud enough. The awkward stuff is what we generally don't put in the story.
Yeah, because it's as I said last time, as Hitchcock said, it's life with all the boring parts cut out. So cut out the uninteresting parts of dialogue. You can make a character's voice unique. You can make a character's voice realistic. But in the process of that, make your character's voice readable by taking out all the things that are unnecessary, all this extraneous dialogue.
A lot of people say that stories are about revealing a truth, and and that's a human truth. It's a truth about people. And so you're writing to in your own way reveal some kind of a truth to people the way you see it. That doesn't mean that everything you put in your story has to be true, and it doesn't mean people have to talk the way they talk. So exactly the way they talk. So that's where I'm coming down there.
I mean, even if you're trying to write something that is a slice of life, I mean, even if it's ripped straight from life, and the point, and you're not trying to write some sort of narrative, you're just trying to do an exercise. At least make it readable.
This is something that I've never heard writing professors complain about, but boy, if I was teaching writing, I would be complaining about this a lot. Vince, people writing dialogue need to use contractions. People use contractions, okay? When you're talking, you say you say I'll before you say I will. You say you're before you say you are. You're not writing a formal paper, so have people talk the way they talk unless they need it for emphasis.
Yeah, in narrative in the narration, I tend to cut up the words into individual words. But in dialogue, if you're reading something, give your reader some credit. Expect them to be able to look at the words and the letters.
I still think even in exposition, for the most part, depending on what you're doing, unless for some reason you want your story to sound really formal, conversational exposition is better, generally speaking.
I think that's people trying to ingrain in the students how to write a paper more than it is how to write a story.
Oh, I think it is too. Yeah.
So I think it tends to carry over into the fiction classes if that's what they're trying to...
Yeah.
Or if they don't care.
It's a huge no-no for me. People don't talk like that, generally speaking. Okay, here's a few little things, all about just format and stuff like we're talking about, and things to clear it up and make it sound more real. Don't have characters constantly stating the name of the person they're talking to. You see this all the time, and we saw this a lot in playwriting class. Where my name is Captain Logan, your name is Vince, and every time I talk to you, I say Vince, something, 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 and then Vince says, oh, I see, Captain Logan, something, something, something. Okay, if it's established what our names are, and the people watching or reading know that, you don't have to keep constantly saying the person's name again, unless it's for emphasis, unless there's some reason you need to say the person's name. And that's something else that if you can help it, don't give away in dialogue at first, because that sounds like exposition in dialogue. You know what I mean? Mm-hmm. If it's two people that really know each other, they're not gonna be like, "Hello, James." Oh, hello. Victor. Like,
yeah.
It sounds it sounds really forced. People don't generally talk like that. So
I have nothing to add, really.
Old school sitcom-y, really. Watch 50s sitcoms; they're going to talk like that.
That's one of the things that they've I think was maybe one of the reasons that it was so heavy in playwriting is that's kind of what Shakespeare would do. Like, here we are at this place with hoo-da-ha, and you just announce it and then you're done. You just go on with the scene.
We need to cut out any extraneous words that we just don't need. Again, even if it's stuff that people would generally say a lot in real life, if you don't need it, cut it out. Like you said last week, don't be in love with anything. What I see a lot is people starting sentences with "well." I don't know why, but it happens all the time, and you don't need that.
There are two words that bother me: "well" and "just."
Mm-hmm.
Like, just look at it. I mean, wouldn't it just be as easy to say "look at it"?
Yeah.
Wouldn't it be as easy to say "look at it"?
Yeah. Well, I'm having a bad day. How about just "I'm having a bad day"? Very, very often, it's so much more poignant when you take out those extraneous words.
Yeah, we do say "well." We do say "just." We do say "like." We do say "you know." But does it matter? I mean, it doesn't need to be that realistic.
And again, it's not a hard and fast rule. You're going to find places, you're going to find exceptions where you're going to want it. It's going to sound good. But again, like, really use your ear. What sounds good? Give me a really good flow of dialogue. I don't know. Flow is not the right word. I don't like that word. Pace your dialogue out right. Does it? And this is something that I should have said a couple episodes of this ago, but don't feel weird about reading your own work out loud.
Yeah.
That's a really good idea because it's hard to get a really good sense of what it sounds like in your own head. But like read it out loud, and if you don't mind people looking at your work, and if you're if you're the kind of person that can handle this, have someone else read it aloud to you. See what they're stumbling over. Because after all, most of the time you're going to write things for other people to read. So how are they reading it? Can they read it? Do they get how the sentences fit together?
In regards to the word "well," here's something that I think you should consider when you're reading it out loud. Try the alternative. Well, maybe you think it's comic timing for your particular piece. Maybe you think that you need that "well" in there, but read the whole shtick. Read that whole bit as if it didn't have any wells and justs in it, and see if maybe it's funny without it. I mean, there's a lot of people that do that. They say, "I need this well in here because I need a pause." Well, you could just script. If you're writing a script, you could just script a pause, or if you're writing narrative, you could write some narrative.
For the most part, you should try to let your characters speak with decent grammar. For the most part, unless they're the kind of person that just absolutely doesn't. But even still, again, try to make it readable. But a lot of times people will say, "Don't do anything just because you're trying to be lazy." That's the bottom line. You know what I mean? No, really. I know that sounds awful, but I mean, if your whole thing is, well, now I'm writing dialogue, so that means I don't have to worry about modern conventions of grammar and stuff. If you're gonna do it deliberately. Because if you're doing something just as an excuse to not have to write correctly, I guarantee you the rest of your piece is not going to be right.
Yeah, I mean, if you're writing a script, even your dialogue has to look like it makes sense at least, and the stuff you're saying to the filmmaker has to look like it's making sense. Mm-hmm. You need to have some sort of grammatical abilities.
In your everyday life, listen to conversations, pick up nuances, see how people talk, and again, don't translate that directly, but pick up nuances. Figure out when in sentences people are likely to interrupt each other, talk over each other. People do this, and a lot of times people in stories will write. It'll be very clear. Somebody says this thing, and now it's the next person's turn to talk. And now it's the next person's turn to talk. And I mean, a lot of that is okay, but sometimes people do happen to interrupt each other. You know what I'm saying? So again, make it readable, but try to make it sound like a natural flow of conversation. Mm-hmm. Okay, so getting off of that stuff, let's talk a little bit more about the subtleties of what to do with dialogue. And the big one is be understated most of the time. Have your characters speak in, generally speaking, more understated ways. What I mean is, people screaming at each other is not interesting. Mm. Just because you're screaming at each other does not make it good drama. And people have this idea, they're like now I'm in a very intense scene because my characters are angry and screaming at each other. And and you make your stuff more subtle than that. You make it more understated, and a lot of times you can be far more impactful than if characters are just yelling at each other. Oh, and never use all capitals anywhere. Just don't. For the most part, don't do that. Anyway, especially in dialogue, don't do the all capital thing.
Trying to let format speak for you. that will often just lead you into trying to make format replace your ability to write a convincing scene.
Yeah. That's a lazy thing, too.
One of the things I learned from going to a theater, convention, I guess, it was KCACTF. They had this workshop, and this guy said when you're acting, it's not so interesting to be screaming and jumping up and down. Your character is more convincing if you're trying to withhold emotion.
That's right.
And when you're writing narrative, and at least in my head it makes sense, when you're writing narrative, you're the actor as well. So the character's emotions that are going onto this page are being funneled through you onto the page. So withhold your emotion. Make your character withhold emotion because, people do blow up all of a sudden, but that's not nearly as interesting. I mean, I listened to a friend of mine at one point, actually. She said my scene was so much better than hers, but the girl that won over wasn't jumping up and down screaming, and in her scene she was.
Yeah.
So it's one of those things, withhold your emotion, let the tension, let the tension reign.
Last week, Vince, you brought up subtext, which is not something we've really talked a lot about, and it is something that that ends up being a really major part of dialogue, because people in real life do say one thing and mean something else, or they say one thing and it means several things, or it means a couple things. So really be mindful of what you're having your characters your characters say. It's not always going to be just surface stuff. I'm telling you, it's not always about giving information, right? A lot of times having conversations with another person is a lot more about what emotions you're trying to convey to a person, what emotions you're trying not to convey to a person.
Mm-hmm. I mean, I think part of the difficulty of subtext is what does your audience need to be told, and what does your audience need to have inferred so the story can be artistically told. Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely.
I mean, I've written a story at one point where people told me I didn't get that until the end, and I thought, well, maybe I should have made it more blatant. And then I had other people disagree and say, no, that was perfectly where it needed to be. It didn't need to be more obvious than that. And I thought, well, I guess that's just taste then. So how do you weigh the difference?
This is just a minor point, but do be mindful of the timeliness of what your characters are talking about. If you have a couple of people who are having a conversation about something that's like really tied to stuff going on right now, current events, and it's not going to be relevant a year from now, or nobody's going to care a year from now, you might want to think about that. You may be trying to write something that's just for the here and now, and that's fine. But if you're not, if you want it to be readable 5 years from now, 10 years from now, 20 years from now, you may want to you may want to cut down on certain kinds of references.
There's a reason why so many times when you read comics, the president is a faceless man.
Yeah, absolutely.
So you only see him from his suit collar or something.
And again, it's not a hard and fast rule, but you don't want to alienate your reader either.
Yeah.
And certainly, I feel like I shouldn't even have to say this, but certainly avoid inside jokes and stuff that only mean something to you, unless you're only writing for yourself or your friends. Really don't do that. Don't write something and then have to tell a person why it's there. Be like, well, you're not going to understand this, but this is something that means something to my friends and I, so I felt like I had to put it in there.
Yeah, if I'm writing a stand-up routine and I talk about a particular chain that only appears in Kansas, or like a chain restaurant that only appears in Kansas, and I take that joke to New York, they're not going to get me, and why did they bother to hire me to begin with? Because I'm obviously not talking to that crowd.
Last week you wanted to talk about flashbacks, and let's say that an important conversation from the past should only be in flashback when it's totally necessary, right? Yeah. If you can find another way to do it, you should do it.
Yeah.
But if it's like a really important exchange that happened that's going to somehow inform the rest of the story, then that's fine. Find a way to put it in there and do it in a short flashback. But if you can give information about the past in a different way, you want to.
I think it's a good exercise for young writers to, and I'm including myself in this actually, to not use flashbacks, to find another way. Try to find some way that's natural. Try to find some way that's organic to the story. And
I'm always impressed when I see a film where there's a character that I feel is totally well-rounded, that I totally understand, and that I feel like I got a good sense of what he was before the story started, and yet we never went to flashback. That's always very impressive to me whenever that's doable, especially when it's very much about the past. You know, the past. When it's about like the past intruding on the present, or a person who is like stuck in the past. It's pretty cool when you got a character who. That's a story we didn't talk about last week. The stuck in the past story, and it's pretty impressive when you got a character who's living in the past and we never see them in the past.
I do think that I'm not going to say that you should never do a flashback. I will not say that, but I do think that if you can find another way, you should probably do it the other way. It's
another one of those lazy things that I think some people, kind of like dream sequences, they just think they're cool. Like, and now I'm going to show you the past. Now, I think it's a power thing sometimes. It's like I'm in control of this universe, and so I'm going to show you what I want to show you when I want to show it to you. But that doesn't mean that it's effective. And so that's the problem. Is that yes, you do have the power. Yes, you are in control, and you start relinquishing that control when people don't. When people aren't buying into what you're trying to sell them.
Yeah, I think it's much less interesting to show us the past. I think it's much more interesting to show us how the past affects the present.
As a rule of thumb, and I don't know what you're going to think of this, Vince, but this is something that I learned through a couple professors who were telling me this in college, and the more I thought about it, the more I liked this. As a rule of thumb, here are 3 scenes you should try not to write if you can absolutely help it. 3 places that you shouldn't have scenes at. One is in hospitals. And the reason is because that is an immediate place where we think of drama, right? Where if somebody's like in a car crash or got hurt or something, a lot of times young writers will want to will want to immediately go to a hospital and show people crying, people grieving, that kind of stuff. Be more subtle than that, because it's not interesting. You're just, generally speaking, when you go to a hospital, you're just halting the story, right? Mm-hmm. Same is also true of funerals.
Like, let's take time out to grieve for a little while.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and it's just you don't always need that. It's usually a lot more interesting to show characters doing things, and then how the bad thing that happened is affecting their regular life. Yes, they would go to the funeral. You can certainly mention that there was a funeral. You can show us pieces of it or whatever. But further the narrative. Keep the thing moving. Does something happen at the funeral? Does something happen at the hospital? Or are you just bringing us there so that you can show that a character feels bad?
The last thing you need is just time to sit there and brood. I mean, through snippets, we can figure out that a character is brooding, even for a long period of time. And we don't need you to sit there and tell us that your character is unhappy because of this, and there's an extended unhappiness, so we have to sit there and experience that extended unhappiness.
And characters need to be doing something while they're talking. It's so much more interesting than when 2 characters are just sitting down or standing around. Have them doing something. That's why very often you have characters eating in scenes. And things like that. Find something for characters to be doing, because guess what? People usually do things when they're talking. And so avoid phone conversations if you can.
Yeah.
I would say nearly at all costs don't do phone conversations. Because, yes, people talk on the phone a lot, especially now. People talk on the phone all the time, but isn't it interesting?
Yeah.
You see what I'm saying? Especially in this day and age, isn't it a whole lot cooler if you got a character who's not constantly on the phone?
Yeah.
They're going to be more proactive, I guarantee it.
I don't know if this is the way it is in narrative, but in screenwriting they call it walking and talking. You do something while you're talking to somebody. And if you watch The Verdict, they do a very good job of doing that. A Verdict is I think it's Paul Newman, whatever. I forget the guy who's in it. But there's a movie called The Verdict, and they even blatantly state it. One character says to the next as they're about to have a conversation, "Do you mind if we walk and talk?" It's something that you should do. There's no reason you shouldn't. Otherwise, it's just 2 talking heads back and forth at each other.
We get fixated on dialogue. Dialogue's a lot of fun to write. Right? We get really fixated on it. But what a character is doing is just as important, and sometimes more so, than what they're saying. And again, how they're saying it is important. So I mean, you really want to focus on what a character is doing and what decisions they're making, and let the dialogue come from that rather than the dialogue being the focal point of everything. Mm-hmm. Okay, give characters their own voice. This is super hard, but don't have all your characters sound the same. Different people talk in different ways. So again, like we were talking about a couple weeks ago when we were talking about character, figure out who your character is, and then you'll be able to figure out how they're going to talk, and keep all that stuff in mind that we were talking about during the character conversation. Consider age, experience, profession, environment, upbringing, education, etc., etc. All of those things are going to go into how a person talks and what they say.
I mean, if you're a particularly eloquent type of guy and you're trying to write a Cockney British person, maybe you should try to switch up some of your word choices every now and again.
Yeah, exactly. And again, it's very difficult to do. But this is a lot of the reason that a couple weeks ago I said that if you're if you're new to writing, sometimes going first person is difficult, because first person is a lot like writing dialogue, right? Because it's like I'm telling you the story, and so I have to tell the whole thing in a voice. Now, third person, certainly there's a voice also, but I'm just saying that, like, it's difficult sometimes for it not to just come off as your voice. And then when you've got multiple people talking, and they've all got to sound different, yeah, it can be hard. So you want to pay attention to how different kinds of people talk. And again, age and experience is huge. Somebody who's 45 is not going to sound like somebody who's 21. Generally speaking.
Our playwriting professor at KU once suggested that we go out and just eavesdrop on people.
Yeah.
Just to listen to how people talk. And I think that's a terrific idea. I'm not saying that you should go out there and eavesdrop on conversation and get gossip. That's not important. But go out there and just listen to people.
Sit behind somebody in a restaurant or something, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, there was one point I was trapped effectively at an old folks' home just listening to old people talk. And I thought, you know what, this is interesting, because just listen to the way these people talk who are, 70, 80 years older than you are. It's a good experience. I mean, I think you should, listen to vocal inflections, listen to the word choices, listen to the sentence structure.
Yeah, absolutely. And the final thing I'm going to say on this particular topic is there's an old adage that it's as important as a writer to read as it is to write. I think that's very true. I think that in order to do the best dialogue you can, and this is true, this is important for everything you write, but if you're wanting to have different people talking in different ways, your current vocabulary may just not be completely up to the task. The more you read, the more words you're going to know. And I think reading all the time is a really good way to build up your vocabulary. But I really think that if you want to write great dialogue, learn more vocabulary. Build up that vernacular. Because again, not everybody has the same vernacular. So
especially if you're writing characters that would have a better vocabulary than you even might. So
yeah, exactly, that kind of thing. So anyway, Vince, next week we're going to do our final week on writing. And we're going to be, we're actually not going to be talking about really so much writing the narrative itself now, because we've gone through 4 weeks of that. So we're going to be talking about workshopping, critiquing, publishing, and just overall the writing life, how to be motivated. The idea of should you write every day? How do you keep on top of stuff? How do you finish things? That's a question I get all the time. People are like, well, I started things, but I can't finish stuff. That sort of thing. So we're really going to talk about the act of writing itself, and we'll talk a little bit about how publishing works, the self-publishing versus regular publishing, that kind of stuff. I know a little bit about that, and we'll talk about how workshopping works and our experiences in college from that, and then we'll be done with this whole series.
All right. How to finish things. Last episode.
That's how you do it. You plan on an episode, and then you show up and you do it. Well, thanks a lot for listening to Geeks Not Nerds, the podcast, and I'm Captain Logan.
And I'm Vince.
See you next time.